Motions are dropping like hotcakes. I still haven't finished part 3 of the verdict slips rabbit hole. And we've also got Aidan Carney's motion to dismiss coming up in the next couple of days, on the 4th I believe. But the special prosecutor still hasn't filed a response. And so I go off on this little mission to find out what happens if they don't file a response. And bam! I end up in obstruction of justice territory. Yet another rabbit hole. So how did I get here? Let's start with the process. Over the last couple of days we've been talking about prosecutorial misconduct. Obviously because Karen Reid's team filed a motion to dismiss based on egregious prosecutorial misconduct. So how did my research progress from prosecutorial misconduct to full-blown obstruction? Well, let me explain. Let's start with the definitions. Prosecutorial misconduct happens when a prosecutor violates legal or ethical rules to gain an unfair advantage in the case. This can include withholding exculpatory evidence, i.e. Brady violations, improperly influencing witnesses, making false statements in court, and engaging in ex parte communication with judges. All of which we know has happened in Karen Reid's case. And I've put a great deal of attention towards violations of due process in the last couple of days, not just by the prosecution, but also by Aunty Bev. And that moves us into corruption territory. When misconduct goes beyond errors or bad decisions and becomes intentional efforts to manipulate the case, it shifts towards corruption. We're talking collusion between the prosecution and key witnesses. We're talking using law enforcement to intimidate defense witnesses or journalists. We're talking knowingly presenting false or misleading evidence. We know all of those things have happened in Karen Reid's case, but now all those things are going to cross over because one of Aidan's attorneys, Mark Bederow, is going to join Karen Reid's team. And let's face it, there was crossover long before that because they were trying to pin Aidan's witness intimidation charges on Karen. Whichever way you look at it, there's crossover. This includes DA Morrissey's ex parte communications with key witnesses in Karen's case, surveillance of Aidan Carney by Canton Police as an intimidation tactic, and using Carney's pending case as a weapon to shape public perception of Karen. Clearly, we have reached the corruption stage. But how do we go from corruption to obstruction of justice? Enter Andrea Campbell. If you need a refresher, go back and watch the last video. It's got corruption plastered on the thumbnail. You can't miss it. And I'll chuck it in the description just in case. So how do we get there? Obstruction of justice happens when officials intentionally block legal processes to prevent evidence from being discovered, used, or presented in court. This can include destroying or hiding records, blocking the defense from preserving key evidence, and judicial rulings designed to protect the prosecutors, not the law. This all pertains to Judge Cannoni, not necessarily Andrea Campbell yet. So we know that she has ruled to block defence efforts to preserve DA Morrissey's records. We know that DA Morrissey has appointed himself as the taint team, or Hank Brennan rather, allowing him to filter and suppress his own emails before anyone else sees them. And the court ensuring that any potential ex parte communication between the DA and Aunty Bev is buried. These things become obstruction because it's no longer about winning a trial. It's about hiding the truth. It's about weaponising the legal system against justice itself. So where does Andrea Campbell come into it? Well, she comes into it at step 2 in the corruption phase to begin with, because the habeas corpus petition is meant to be reviewed by neutral parties, not handled by the same prosecutorial team that has a vested interest in suppressing the petition. Assigning a biased ADA to review the habeas corpus petition is an intentional manoeuvre to keep control over a process that is meant to safeguard against wrongful convictions or prosecutorial misconduct. So we know that the ADA was improperly assigned to the habeas court That means the very office that could be accused of constitutional violations is controlling the legal challenge against those violations. As we've already mentioned, this creates a conflict of interest because now it's no longer neutral or impartial. Now it's specifically to protect the DA. So instead of allowing a fair judicial review, the system is manipulated to favour the prosecution, ensuring that any habeas petition challenging prosecutorial misconduct is effectively dead on arrival. So let's say Team Reid never directly raises misconduct in the current habeas petition, and the court doesn't specifically go looking for it. Has Andrea Campbell still progressed into the corruption phase? Well, we addressed this in my previous video. The main concern is that the same ADA who represented the trial court at the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court is now representing the Commonwealth in the habeas petition. And this directly challenges separation of powers between the executive and the judiciary. They're probably just trying to pass this off as procedurally normal because the ADA handled previous appeals, then that's their role in this case. So if the habeas petition is strictly about Judge Cannoni's mistrial ruling and not prosecutorial misconduct, then they most likely would argue that this appointment is procedurally normal. But it's problematic because the ADA is not neutral or impartial. Then you have to ask questions like, was the ADA deliberately retained to prevent an independent review by the Attorney General's office or the habeas court itself? Is the ADA trying to help cover up prosecutorial misconduct or judicial errors so that they can continue prosecuting the defendant? Either way, the ADA's continued involvement suggests an improper relationship between the prosecution and Judge Cannoni, where rulings benefit the prosecution at the expense of the defence. So essentially the main issue that we have is not just whether the ADA can legally represent the Commonwealth, but whether his involvement ensures that the habeas petition is handled in a way that shields the prosecution and the court from scrutiny. So either way, that's why it's corruption. But it also moves into obstruction of justice, because it's blocking a legitimate legal remedy. Habeas corpus is a constitutional mechanism to challenge unlawful detention or legal violations. If an improperly assigned ADA uses their position to block, delay, or deny a legitimate habeas challenge, this crosses into obstruction of justice. So again, in reference to Karen Reid's case, if the ADA actively prevents key evidence from being reviewed in the habeas process, or if the assignment was done intentionally to ensure that Reid could not challenge prosecutorial misconduct, or if the judge and the prosecution worked together to ensure improper assignment stood, making it impossible for the defence to get a fair review. It becomes obstruction when officials manipulate the process by controlling who reviews the petition. They are blocking access to justice and shielding potential misconduct from oversight. That oversight being habeas corpus, one of the oldest and most fundamental protections against wrongful prosecution. So, in the big picture, if the ADA's improper assignment was a mistake, Andrea Campbell, it's misconduct. If it was done deliberately to ensure a favourable ruling, it's corruption. If it was done to prevent a legitimate habeas challenge from succeeding, it's obstruction of justice. So with regard to the habeas, it actually looks like it falls between corruption and obstruction, since it appears to be a coordinated effort to prevent fair judicial review. This is an escalation of control over the legal system itself, not just the trial, but the very mechanism meant to check prosecutorial power. Okay, so now we got the basics out the way. What does it have to do with Aidan's case? And how did I get to obstruction by looking up Aidan's case? And the answer is Bederow. Regardless whether Aidan's case gets dismissed or it goes to trial, we know that Bradel and Bederow uncovered ex parte communications between D.A. Morrissey, other judges, and D.A. Morrissey and witnesses in the Karen Reid case. as pro hac vice in Karen's case is a direct pipeline to damaging information from Carney's case. And that's why Hank Brennan doesn't want him in. And also why Judge Bev is trying to stall the decision. How are they going to limit the damaging information from being entered in as evidence to Karen Reid's trial? Obviously, they both need time to cook up a strategy. That strategy, with or without Bederow, is going to involve suppressing the use of DA Morrissey's communications with witnesses and other judges from being used in Karen Reid's retrial. We're going to hear all the usual objections, relevance, prejudice, ongoing litigation. But Judge Bev's actually made a rod for her back here, because in Trial 1.0 she overruled both the defence and the prosecution with regard to allowing Aidan Carney's name to be brought up, organically, quote unquote. So how is she going to have that happen, while at the same time ruling that evidence from Carney's case is inadmissible? Will she try to block all references to Carney's case entirely, so that jurors never hear about the misconduct exposed in his proceedings? Or will she only limit it to the prejudicial bits that he was harassing witnesses by exercising constitutionally protected activities? Of course, we already know their gaslighting technique by now. What's good for thee isn't necessarily good for me. You can basically work out what they're doing behind the scenes by listening to what they are accusing the defence of doing. This is typical abuser behaviour, and since they're at the top of the food chain, abusers, I fully expect it to continue. But here's where we crossed over into Judge Bev being involved in the cover-up and obstruction of justice territory. If it turns out that DA Michael Morrissey has engaged in ex parte communication with Judge Bev, that would be a catastrophic breach of judicial ethics and due process. She knows that, Morrissey knows that, and that's why Hank Brennan is the taint team. Why would he need to filter his own records? Why is he trying to hide direct messages between himself and Cannoni? Would Cannoni suppress evidence of her own misconduct? If ex parte communications exist between Judge Bev and DA Morrissey, then she has a strong personal incentive to let Morrissey filter his own records to ensure they never reach Reid's defence. And that would be outright judicial corruption, not just bias. Would her secret communications with Morrissey expose things like granting favourable motions to the prosecution while restricting Reid's defence, or allowing suppression of evidence that could undermine the state's case, or refusing to hold prosecutors accountable for discovery violations or Brady violations, or discussions about delaying or derailing defence motions while expediting prosecution requests? Who knows? What we do know is that if Judge Bev has been improperly influenced by the DA's office, then Reid's trial is already compromised before it even begins. And I'm not talking about Judge Bev as putting herself in a position of being fired or taken off the bench or punished in any way. We're talking about Reid's civil rights. If ex parte communications are confirmed, then Karen could have a case of federal civil rights violation under USC 42 section 1983, deprivation of a right to a fair trial due to judicial and prosecutorial misconduct, which could then open up federal intervention by the DOJ, or they could take it up with a federal habeas court. So yes, of course DA Morrissey and Judge Bev have an incentive to hide the information. But the mere fact that Judge Bev has already ruled in favour of the prosecutor and blocked all defence efforts to preserve the records about the DA Morrissey stuff and allowed Mr. Brennan to be the taint team for DA Morrissey, then we now know we're no longer dealing with just bias. This is an active, coordinated cover-up to obstruct exculpatory evidence and shield misconduct. She's literally signalled that any ex parte communications between Morrissey and herself are now almost certainly real, and the court is ensuring they never see the light of day. How? by abandoning procedural fairness. What should happen is those records should be reviewed by a neutral party. Her refusal to preserve potential evidence of misconduct violates Karen's constitutional rights under Brady v. Maryland and the 14th Amendment. If she's blocking record preservation because she has a personal stake in what those records contain, then that is judicial conflict of interest. Allowing the destruction of potentially incriminating communications, bam, you guessed it, obstruction of justice. So now you know how we got from misconduct to corruption to flat out obstruction of justice. Thank you, Mark Bederow. And of course Timothy Bradel and Aidan Carney, who has probably put the most on the line for this. I'd like to say give them a round of applause, but they deserve so much more. Together, Karen's team and Carney's team have ensured that neither of them are going to see a day in jail. Round of applause anyway.